The morning had that sharp, metallic kind of cold that wraps around you before you even step out of your truck. November 2018. The sun hadn't bothered to show up yet, and the Broken Arrow County auction yard looked almost abandoned in the gray light. But Wesley Callahan was already there, same as he had been for the past 32 years. 2 hours early, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, and a quiet confidence that nothing in this place could surprise him anymore. He'd seen it all. Champions fallen from glory. Backyard horses no one wanted to feed anymore. Animals people dumped like old furniture. And still, he kept showing up. Because this was his world, his routine, his responsibility. But that morning, the moment he walked down the aisle of stalls and reached number 7, he stopped the way a person stops when their brain has to catch up with reality. A bay gelding stood in the far corner, half hidden in shadow. Not tied, not fidgeting, not calling out, just standing very still, as if the weight of being noticed might be too much. His coat, a muted shade of what clearly used to be bright copper, clung to his frame without any shine. The ribs showing along his sides told a story all by themselves. Hunger, hardship, long days with too little. Yet even that wasn't what made Wesley's breath hitch. There, tucked neatly into the horse's bridle, was a piece of paper in a plastic sleeve. Clean, protected, placed with purpose, not tossed in haste. And for some reason, Wesley couldn't explain, that tiny detail hit harder than the cold. He reached for it slowly, instinctively, almost reverently. His fingers brushed the cheap plastic. The note fluttered gently, just a whisper of motion. But the barn felt suddenly too quiet, like it was holding its breath with him. After all his years in this business, after all the stories he'd witnessed, something about that little rectangle of paper made his hands tremble. He slipped it free and opened it. The handwriting inside was careful, painfully careful. Each letter drawn like the writer had been afraid of getting even one stroke wrong, almost childlike, almost desperate. And the first sentence hit him like a punch in the chest. His name is Copper. Wesley didn't know it yet, but that note was about to change everything. His morning, his plans, the horse's future, and the lives of people who hadn't even entered the story yet. Wesley stood there with the note open in his hands, the paper already soft around the edges from whoever had folded and unfolded it too many times. The first few lines alone were enough to make his throat tighten. He is 12 years old. He loves apples and carrots. He likes having his ears scratched. He is gentle. He is kind. It read like someone trying to introduce their best friend to a stranger, trying to convince the world that this horse mattered. And then the truth spilled across the page, raw and heartbreaking. The writer had lost their job. Then their home. Then everything else that made life feel even remotely stable. For the past week, they'd been living in a truck with the horse tied to a tree at a rest stop. No food, no shelter, no plan, just survival. And even that was slipping through their fingers. They wrote about watching Copper lose weight, about hearing him nicker hopefully every time a stranger walked by, thinking food might follow, about the guilt of knowing love wasn't enough to keep another living being alive. "I can't do this to him anymore," the note said. "Please don't send him to slaughter. Please find him a good home. He's been my best friend for 7 years. Please tell him I'm sorry." No name, no signature. No clue who had stood in this very stall just hours earlier, leaving behind the only thing they had left to give, a goodbye written through tears. Wesley read the note twice, then a third time, and realized something he hadn't expected. This wasn't abandonment. This was love refusing to turn into neglect, and that made the whole thing even heavier. Wesley folded the note with a care that felt almost ceremonial and slipped it back into its plastic sleeve. His breath fogged the cold morning air as he looked at the gelding again. Copper. The name suddenly carried weight, like he'd been introduced to someone whose story he wasn't supposed to ignore. Copper lifted his head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was no bite in that gaze, no fear, no aggression. Just a quiet sadness, old and tired and far too deep for a horse his age. Wesley had seen neglected horses before, dozens of them. But this wasn't the same. Neglect came with a certain dull emptiness. This felt like grief. And grief meant someone had loved him once. Wesley exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his face. 32 years in this job had taught him how to stay detached, to keep the machine running, to treat every horse with fairness, but not sentiment. But rules had a way of breaking when the right story finally walked into your barn. He made the decision before he'd even realized he was making it. "Not this one," he murmured. Copper wasn't going into the ring, not today, not ever, not as long as Wesley had breath left in him. Because the person who left that note behind, they hadn't been running away from responsibility, they'd been out of options, and they had trusted this place, trusted him, to give their horse a chance. He couldn't betray that. Wesley pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he knew by heart. When Beverly picked up, her voice carried that mix of exhaustion and resilience that only someone who spent their life saving animals could have. "Morning, Wes," she said. "What's going on?" He swallowed hard. "I need you here," he managed. "Now, if you can. I've got a horse with a story you need to hear." There was a pause. Brief. Waited. Beverly wasn't the type to ask unnecessary questions. "Text me the address of the stall," she said. "I'm on my way." An hour later, her truck rolled into the lot. Beverly stepped out, silver hair pulled back, boots still dusted from whatever chore she'd left unfinished. She carried herself with the kind of calm that reassured even the most frightened animals. Wesley handed her the note before she even reached the stall. She read it slowly, her thumb resting just above the last sentence, the "I'll never forget him" part. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy. "Where is he?" she asked quietly. Wesley led her to stall 7. Copper lifted his head again, ears tilting forward with polite interest. Beverly approached him the way you approach someone who's been hurt enough for a lifetime, slow, soft, offering space, but also warmth. She whispered something to him, words meant only for the two of them. Copper stepped closer. He sniffed her hand. Then he pressed his nose into her palm, like he wanted to believe her kindness was real, but wasn't sure he deserved it anymore. Beverly touched his cheek, her voice barely above a breath. "Oh, sweetheart, what did the world do to you?" She took her time examining him with the practiced hands of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Underweight, overgrown hooves, dull coat, but underneath, good structure, sound legs, kind eyes, the kind of horse who had once been loved deeply. "He's coming with me," she finally said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Wesley shook his head. "No." "He's coming with you, but he's not costing you a dime. I'm buying him out myself. Consider it a donation to the rescue." Beverly stared at him, stunned. "Wes, that's too much." He cut her off with a small, tired smile. "It's not half as much as that man gave up to leave him here." And just like that, Copper's future shifted. No auction, no slaughter trucks, no uncertainty. Just hope. Delivered in the back of Beverly's horse trailer, rolling toward a place where broken things got a second chance. The drive to Rolling Hills Rescue Ranch was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over people when they're carrying something fragile. Hope, fear, a life hanging in the balance. Beverly kept glancing into the trailer, checking on Copper through the small window as they bumped along the country road. He stood calmly, almost too calmly, like a horse who'd learned not to expect much from the world anymore. When they finally rolled through the rescue gates, Beverly stepped out with a purpose. Rolling Hills wasn't some polished, wealthy equestrian center. It was a place built from determination, duct tape, and sheer heart. Weathered fences, pastures patched together over the years, horses of every shape and story scattered in paddocks, but every single one of them safe. And now, Copper was one of them. The veterinarian arrived within the hour, a woman Beverly trusted with her own life. Together they went over Copper carefully, every rib, every joint, every hoof. The verdict surprised them both. Despite everything he'd been through, Copper was fundamentally sound, malnourished, dehydrated, infested with parasites, hooves overgrown, but nothing broken beyond repair. "Give him a few months," the vet said, scratching Copper's cheek. "His body can bounce back. His heart, that might take longer." Beverly took that as her mission. She structured his feed program with precision, small, carefully measured meals to avoid refeeding syndrome. She had the farrier trim away months of neglect, working slowly so Copper wouldn't panic. She brushed him gently each day, talking to him like he was someone who just needed to hear a human voice that wasn't trembling with worry. Copper tolerated everything with quiet politeness, but that spark, joy, curiosity, anything that made a horse feel alive, that was gone. He didn't beg for treats, didn't lift his head when other horses called out. He moved like he was conserving whatever little strength he had left. "He's grieving," the vet told her on a follow-up visit. "Horses don't just lose homes, they lose people." And Beverly felt the weight of that truth. So she sat with him, literally sat, with her back against the stall wall while Copper stood beside her. She read paperwork, drank her morning coffee, let him breathe in the presence of someone who wasn't leaving. Weeks passed, then months, and one morning in February, the first crack in Copper's sadness finally showed. Beverly opened the pasture gate, expecting the same slow shuffle to the fence line. Instead, Copper paused, looked out at the open field, and then, out of nowhere, bolted. Not out of fear, but out of something like rediscovered freedom. He galloped across the frosty grass, bucking once, then twice, tail streaming behind him like he'd remembered for the first time that he was meant to run. Beverly pressed a hand to her mouth, tears blurring her vision. The body was healing. But now, finally, the heart was waking up too. As winter melted into the softer light of early spring, Copper continued to unfold piece by piece, like a story slowly remembering its own beginning. He wasn't the kind of horse who transformed overnight. There was no dramatic moment where everything snapped into place. Instead, it happened in quiet increments, tiny shifts only someone who truly paid attention would notice. He started lifting his head when Beverly entered the barn. Then, weeks later, he nickered, softly, tentatively, like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to want someone's attention again. He let volunteers groom him, patiently standing while small hands fumbled with brushes. Children adored him, of course they did. Gentle horses always drew kids like magnets, and Copper, even in his sadness, was gentle to the core. He never pinned his ears, never flinched, never so much as swished his tail in irritation. He simply accepted their affection with quiet dignity. But there was still a distance in him, a small invisible wall that hadn't been there before life had broken him open. Beverly could feel it every time she rested her hand on his neck. A slight hesitation, a part of him still listening for footsteps that would never return. Copper might have been safe, but he hadn't yet let himself believe it. So Beverly decided it was time to think about his next chapter. The rescue wasn't meant to be a final stop for every horse. It was a place to heal, to regroup, to rediscover trust. But to truly thrive, Copper needed a person again, a partner, a home, someone who would make him feel chosen. Applications came in, as they always did, some from families wanting a calm horse, some from riders looking for a quiet companion for trail days. All of them perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable, and all of them wrong. Beverly couldn't explain it, but she knew. Copper needed something rare, a soul that resonated with his, a kind of person who didn't just love horses, but understood loss. Then, one late spring afternoon, a new visitor stepped through the barn doors, Dr. Amy Freeman. Recently retired veterinarian, soft-spoken, calm, sharp-eyed. The sort of woman whose presence could settle a frightened animal from across a pasture. She didn't rush from stall to stall. She walked slowly, letting each horse introduce themselves in their own way. And when she reached Copper, she stopped completely. Copper's ears flicked forward. He stepped toward her before she even moved. Amy raised a hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. An invitation, not a demand. Copper leaned into it, breathing her in, and Beverly knew instantly. Something in him recognized her. Maybe not her face, but her energy, her steadiness, her quiet, unwavering kindness. "Tell me about this one," Amy said softly, still touching Copper's cheek as though she'd known him for years. So, Beverly told her everything. The note, the heartbreak, the long climb back to trust. And Amy listened, not with pity, but with understanding. When Beverly finished, Amy looked at Copper the way someone looks at a lost story they suddenly want to carry forward. "I'd like to adopt him," she said, "if you think I'm the right fit." Beverly didn't just think it. She felt it in her bones. Copper had finally found his home. Copper's move to Meadowbrook Farm felt less like a transfer and more like a quiet turning point. One of those moments that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but shifts the center of a life forever. Amy prepared for his arrival the way people prepare for something precious, double-checking the stall bedding, organizing feed bins, laying out brushes and blankets as if she were welcoming an old friend rather than a new horse. When the trailer pulled into her driveway, she didn't rush. She approached with that same calm she'd shown in the rescue barn, letting Copper sense her before she ever reached for him. He stepped out carefully, ears flicking, taking in the new smells, the trees, the quiet hum of the countryside. It wasn't fear. It was cautious curiosity, the kind that comes from a heart learning how to trust the world again. And Amy matched his pace, step for step. She walked him through his new stall, spacious, warm, with a run-out paddock that opened into a field of soft grass. She let him explore, sniff the corners, look out the window, decide for himself if this place could be home. He settled faster than Beverly expected. Maybe faster than anyone expected. Within days, he began meeting Amy at the stall door each morning, a gentle nicker rumbling out of him as soon as he heard her boots in the aisle. She didn't overwhelm him with expectations, just slow, simple connection. Grooming sessions where she talked to him quietly, slow trail rides through shaded paths, grazing together in silence as if settling into the same rhythm. Copper responded in ways that felt like tiny miracles. He started following her around the pasture like a big, copper-colored shadow. He lifted his head when she laughed. He rested his nose on her shoulder when she paused during chores. And little by little, the last remnants of that winter sadness drained from his eyes. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Months passed, then years, 3 of them, steady and peaceful. Copper grew strong again. His coat regained its shine. His muscles filled back in. And though Amy never pushed him beyond gentle work, he carried her through the hills with a quiet pride that felt like gratitude turned into motion. Sometimes, in those peaceful moments, Amy's thoughts drifted back to the anonymous author of the note. She wondered what kind of person had written those trembling words. She wondered where they were now, whether they'd gotten back on their feet, whether they ever thought about the horse they had loved enough to let go. She hoped they were okay. She hoped they had peace, because Copper had found his, or so she believed, until the day a battered pickup truck pulled into her driveway and a stranger stepped out, looking like he was carrying 5 years of fear and hope in the same breath. But that moment, the moment everything changed again, was still waiting just ahead. Amy first heard the truck before she saw it, a low, uneven rumble pulling up her gravel driveway on a Saturday afternoon that should have been uneventful. She'd been mucking stalls, lost in the rhythm of work, when the sound broke her focus. No vet appointment, no farrier visit, no neighbors expected, just an engine that didn't belong. She set the pitchfork aside and stepped out of the barn. A battered pickup sat in the middle of the drive, sun-faded paint, dents along the door, the kind of vehicle held together more by stubbornness than mechanics. A man climbed out, tall, thin, a little unsteady, as if just standing upright cost him something. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed. Not dangerous, just tired. Tired in a way that didn't come from a long day, but from a long life. He looked around the property slowly, like every detail mattered. Like he was searching for something specific and was afraid he might not find it. "Can I help you?" Amy called out, walking toward him with careful steps. He turned to face her, and that's when she noticed the tremor in his hands. Sorry, he said, voice rough from disuse. "I'm looking for a horse, a bay gelding named Copper. I heard he might be here." Amy's heart skipped. Of all the things this man could have said, that wasn't the one she was prepared for. "And you are?" she asked, though something inside her already knew. "Dean," he said quietly. "Dean Roberts, 5 years ago. I left my horse at an auction house because I couldn't take care of him anymore. I've been looking for him ever since." The words hung between them like a held breath. The man who wrote the note, the ghost from Copper's past, the fracture in the story she thought had already been healed. "You're the one who wrote it," Amy said softly, not accusing, just trying to absorb it. Dean nodded, blinking rapidly as if trying and failing not to cry. "Is he here? Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." 1,000 feelings collided inside her at once: shock, worry, compassion, protectiveness, and something else she hadn't expected. Relief. Because if this man had come all this way, if he'd spent 5 years searching, his love for Copper hadn't been a moment of desperation. It had been the truth. "He's here," Amy said, "and he's more than okay. Come with me." Dean exhaled shakily, the sound halfway between a sob and a gasp. And as they walked toward the barn, he began telling his story, the parts that never made it into the note. What followed was not a tale of abandonment. It was survival and guilt, and 5 years of clawing his way back toward the one soul he refused to forget. But Copper didn't know any of that yet. He was waiting at the end of the barn aisle, unaware that the past he mourned was about to walk through the door. As they walked toward the barn, Dean's story came out in fragments, halting at first, then faster, like someone finally opening a valve that had been rusted shut for years. He told her what happened after he walked away from Copper that frozen November morning. How he'd driven off with tears blurring the windshield, not because he wanted to leave, but because he'd run out of ways not to. How he'd arrived at a homeless shelter with exactly $47 to his name and no plan for tomorrow, let alone the next week. Those first months were brutal. There's no cleaner word for it. Sometimes the shelter had space, sometimes it didn't. On the nights it didn't, Dean curled up in the front seat of his truck, pulling his jacket tighter around him, replaying that last moment with Copper like a movie he couldn't turn off. Every morning, he woke up with the same hollow ache in his chest. Every night he fell asleep, hoping he'd wake up in some alternate reality where everything had gone differently. He worked whatever day jobs he could find, loading docks, moving furniture, digging trenches in the rain. Anything that paid enough to inch him forward. Every penny he saved felt like a step back toward the horse he'd left behind. "I told myself I wouldn't look for him until I could take care of him," Dean said quietly, voice trembling. "I didn't want to find him just to lose him again." It took 6 months to save enough for a tiny apartment where the pipes rattled and the walls leaned, but it was home. It took another year working 2 jobs to finally feel like he had something resembling stability again. And still, the guilt followed him everywhere, in the grocery store, at the construction site, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. Copper wasn't just a horse to him. He'd been the only living being who stayed when everything else fell apart. When Dean finally felt steady enough to search, he went back to the auction house, only to find new staff who had no memory of an underweight bay gelding from years ago. Thousands of horses passed through. Without registration papers or a brand, he was just one of many. But Dean didn't stop. He called every rescue within a 100-mile radius. He messaged strangers on Facebook groups. He drove to ranches, barns, even backyard stables, asking if anyone had seen a copper-colored gelding with eyes too soft for his own good. Some people were kind. Some told him he was crazy. Most didn't bother responding. Still, Dean said, rubbing a hand over his jaw, I couldn't give up. I owed him that much. Then, 3 weeks ago, he finally got a lead. Someone remembered a rumor, a story. A horse abandoned at an auction with a note tucked into his bridle. They thought he'd ended up at Rolling Hills Rescue. Dean called Beverly immediately. She was skeptical, he admitted with a small, pained laugh. I don't blame her. She probably hears every story in the book. But when I recited that note word for word, that's when she believed me. From there, everything moved quickly. Beverly contacted Amy. Amy spent 3 weeks torn between fear of losing Copper and the gnawing understanding that some stories aren't meant to end halfway. And now, here they were, walking toward the barn where Copper was dozing in the afternoon sunlight, blissfully unaware that the past he never stopped longing for was no longer a ghost. Dean hesitated at the doorway, hands shaking again. Do you think he'll remember me? He asked, barely above a whisper. Amy didn't know. But the truth was simple. Let's find out. The barn was quiet when they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing softly down the concrete aisle. Dust floated in the sunbeams slanting through the high windows, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the air itself knew something important was about to happen. Copper stood at the far end in his stall, half asleep, head lowered, soaking in the warmth coming through the window. He lifted his ears when he heard Amy's voice. Copper, she called gently. He raised his head fully now, ears pricked forward, eyes soft. He offered her a familiar greeting nicker, the sound he always made for her, and only her. But then something changed. His gaze shifted, over Amy's shoulder, to the man standing beside her. Copper froze, not with fear, but with recognition flickering deep in his eyes, like a spark that had been buried under 5 long, heavy years, and suddenly found oxygen again. His ears swiveled forward so sharply they almost touched. His nostrils widened. His entire body leaned toward the stall door before he even seemed aware of it. Dean didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stood there, looking at the horse he'd lost, the horse he'd mourned, the horse he'd searched for through every low point of rebuilding his life. The world held its breath. And then Copper erupted, the soft-eyed, quiet gelding who'd spent years moving with gentle restraint, suddenly transformed into a horse on fire. He let out a sound Amy had never heard from him, loud, raw, a trumpeting whinny that vibrated through the entire barn. He pawed at the stall door, scraping furiously, desperate to close the distance between them. Dean made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh, more like a man breaking open. "Oh, God, Copper," he whispered. "Buddy, it's me." Amy didn't waste a second. She swung open the stall door and stepped aside. Copper shoved past her, not roughly but urgently, like every second apart had been unbearable, and he refused to waste a single one more. He pressed his face against Dean's chest with such force that Dean had to take a step back to keep his balance. Dean wrapped both arms around Copper's neck and just held on like he'd been waiting 5 years for this moment, held on like a man clinging to the one piece of his life that had ever made him feel whole. "I'm sorry," Dean kept repeating, voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to leave you. I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so damn sorry." Copper wasn't just nuzzling him. He was searching him, his pockets, his hands, his clothes, as if confirming this was real, that this wasn't another dream he'd have to wake up from. His whole body trembled with excitement, with relief, with a joy so overwhelming it was almost painful to witness. This wasn't a simple reunion. This was a bond that had refused to die, a connection strong enough to survive poverty, distance, hunger, and time. Amy stood back, tears blurring her vision. She'd loved Copper deeply, but what she was seeing wasn't something she could compete with, and she knew she wasn't meant to. This wasn't about who treated him well. This was about who his heart had chosen years ago. Copper had never forgotten his person, and now, against all odds, his person had found his way back. Dean didn't let go of Copper for a long time, and Copper didn't seem to want him to. The gelding's head stayed pressed against Dean's chest, his breath hot against the fabric of Dean's worn jacket. His tail swished with restless energy, his ears flicking in every direction as if trying to memorize every inch of the moment. It was reunion and relief and release, all tangled together in a way words could barely carry. When Copper finally eased back, it was only far enough to look at Dean properly, really look at him, as if he was taking inventory, the lines on his face, the rough stubble, the weather-beaten skin, the exhaustion, the hope. And whatever he saw there must have been familiar, because Copper let out a soft, shuddering sigh and pressed his forehead gently against Dean's. Amy watched with her hand over her mouth. She'd known this moment was possible. She'd prepared for it. She'd told herself she would be strong, but witnessing it, seeing the horse she'd poured her heart into return to the man he had clearly never stopped loving, was something else entirely. Eventually, Dean lifted his head and turned to her. His face was damp with tears, streaked with dirt from Copper's coat, but there was a light in his eyes now, something raw but alive. "I have a place," he said, words tumbling out, almost frantic. "A real place. 20 acres, a barn, fenced pasture. I've been fixing it up for months, just in case I ever found him. I can take care of him now. I swear I can. I swear I won't fail him again." Amy didn't answer right away. Her heart was trying to speak over her head, and her head was trying to speak over her heart. She thought of Copper greeting her every morning, of trail rides, of grooming sessions, of quiet evenings standing together in the paddock, of the trust she had earned inch by inch. Letting him go felt like pulling out a piece of herself. But then she thought of the note, the trembling handwriting, the apology written through tears, the truth that only a person who loved deeply could write. And she knew. "Dean," she said softly, "I need to see the property. I need to make sure you can provide the right care. There will be paperwork and rules, and a trial period." Dean nodded vigorously, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Anything. Anything you need. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance." He paused, looking at Copper again. Copper, who was now trying to wedge his entire head under Dean's arm like a dog craving impossible closeness. "I'll never let him down again," Dean said. And this time, the words didn't sound desperate. They sounded like a vow. Amy inhaled deeply, grounding herself. "Then," she said, "we'll make this work." Copper tossed his head once, as if he understood every word. And maybe he did. The week that followed felt like a whirlwind wrapped in a slow-motion film. Amy, Beverly, and a trusted veterinarian arranged a day to visit Dean's property, and Dean spent every hour leading up to it preparing like his life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. Copper wasn't just a horse. Copper was the promise he'd made to himself during the darkest years of his life, that one day he'd be worthy again. When the small caravan pulled up to his farm, Dean was already outside waiting, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, foot tapping with nerves he couldn't mask. The property wasn't extravagant or polished, but it was honest, built through sweat and persistence rather than wealth. and it showed. The barn was modest but solid, its wooden beams straight and freshly oiled. Inside, the stalls were thick with clean bedding and good ventilation. The water buckets were scrubbed until they practically shone. Feed bins were neatly labeled. The tack room, though small, was orderly in a way that felt almost reverent. Dean walked them through everything, explaining as he went, not defensively, but with the earnestness of a man who knew every detail mattered. "I patched the fencing myself," he said, pointing out the far pasture line, "and I reinforced the gate latches last month." Didn't want anything loose. He showed them the feed he'd chosen: good quality hay, grain appropriate for a mid-aged gelding, supplements recommended by online equine courses he'd taken through the state extension service. "I wanted to make sure I'd do it right this time," he added, eyes lowering for a moment. The vet walked the property carefully, checking footing, drainage, shelter, feed storage, fencing. Beverly inspected with the practiced eyes of someone who had seen far too many rescues that were anything but safe. Neither found fault. Not one. "This is better than half the boarding barns I've been to," the vet finally said, and Dean laughed, a short, stunned sound that seemed to catch him off guard. Amy stayed quiet for a long time, watching him, watching the way his hands trembled just slightly when he talked about Copper, watching how every improvement on this property carried the imprint of intention, as if he'd built each piece with a purpose, so Copper would have a home. When she finally spoke, Dean stopped breathing. "I think Copper will be happy here," she said softly. Dean exhaled shakily, a sound that was half relief and half disbelief. His eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from grief. They were from gratitude so deep it seemed to pull the tension out of his shoulders. They finalized paperwork at the kitchen table of the small farmhouse, Amy explaining every detail, Dean nodding like a student desperate to get every answer right. When she slid the last page toward him, his signature came out uneven, his hand shaking too hard to hide. Copper's name on paper meant Copper's future was real. The move was scheduled for the following week. And that week, Amy felt everything. She spent extra time with Copper, long grooming sessions, slow walks through the pasture, quiet moments where she simply rested her forehead against his. She memorized the tilt of his ears, the warm weight of his breath against her sleeve, the softness in his eyes when she scratched his favorite spot behind the left ear. Letting go wasn't supposed to feel this much like heartbreak, but she also knew she was doing the right thing. Because sometimes love means holding on, and sometimes it means handing the reins back to the person a horse never stopped waiting for. The morning of the move arrived colder than expected for that time of year, the kind of crisp air that makes every sound feel sharper. Amy woke earlier than she needed to, not because she'd set an alarm, but because her heart had been restless all night. Today, Copper was leaving. Not because she wanted him gone, but because the universe had handed her a truth she couldn't ignore. Copper wasn't hers. He had never truly been hers. She had simply been the keeper of his middle chapters. She brushed him slowly that morning, dragging the soft curry comb in long circles across his gleaming coat. Copper stood unusually still, as if he sensed the weight of the day. Horses always know. Maybe not the details, but the shift in energy, the tightening in a human's breath, the tremble they try to hide in their hands. "It's going to be okay, boy," she whispered, her voice breaking around the edges. "You're going home." When Dean's borrowed trailer pulled into the driveway, Copper's ears shot forward. It wasn't excitement, not exactly. It was recognition, a kind of "there he is," woven into instinct and memory. Dean stepped out of the truck slowly, almost reverently, carrying a calmness that was clearly a thin cover over trembling nerves. His eyes found Copper immediately, softening into something warm and aching. "Hey, buddy," he murmured as he approached. Copper walked to the stall door on his own, stretching his neck toward Dean. It wasn't the frantic, overwhelming burst of the reunion. This was gentler, quieter. The reunion had been the storm. This was the settling after. Dean took his time with the loading. He let Copper sniff the trailer, explore the ramp, paw at a stray piece of hay on the mat. He didn't push him. He didn't rush him. Copper stepped inside when he was ready, not when someone told him to. Trust, restored and visible. Before they closed the doors, Amy approached with a thick folder, medical records, feeding schedules, notes on behavior, photos from his progress, and her personal cell number written neatly on the inside cover. "If you ever need help," she said, "or advice, or if something feels off, you call me. And I want updates, pictures, videos, anything you're willing to share." "You'll get them," Dean promised. His voice had steadied, but his eyes shone with emotion. "Amy, I can't thank you enough. You saved his life. You gave him everything I couldn't." She shook her head gently. "You saved his life first. When you left him at that auction instead of letting him starve, you made the hardest decision a person can make. You gave him a chance." Dean swallowed hard, unable to speak. The trailer doors closed with a final metallic click. Amy stepped back, hands trembling even though she tried to keep them still. Watching the truck pull away felt like watching a part of her heart disappear down the road, but there was no bitterness, just a deep, quiet certainty that she had done right by Copper. She raised a hand in farewell as the truck reached the end of the driveway. Copper's silhouette shifted inside the trailer, a soft shape moving toward the side where Dean's voice came through, calm and steady. Amy stood there long after the dust settled, letting the silence wrap around her like a blanket warming an ache. She had lost a horse she loved deeply, but she had also witnessed something rare. She had played a part in a story that mattered, and Copper was finally going home. Dean kept his promise before he even finished unpacking the trailer. Less than 2 hours after arriving home, Amy's phone buzzed with a message, a single photo of Copper standing in his new stall. His ears were forward, his eyes bright, his head hanging over the door like he owned the place already. Beneath the picture, Dean had written only 2 words: "He's settled." It was the beginning of a steady stream. Every few days, sometimes every day, Amy received new updates. Copper grazing in a pasture so green it looked painted. Copper following Dean across the yard like an oversized dog. Copper meeting the farrier. Copper dozing under a tree. Copper sniffing the pockets of Dean's nephew, who quickly decided he'd found his new best friend. Each message reassured Amy she'd made the right choice. Copper wasn't just adjusting, he was thriving. But the message that broke her, in the best possible way, came about 4 weeks later. Dean sent a video, just 30 seconds long, no caption. In it, Copper stood on the far end of the pasture, grazing peacefully. Dean called his name once, just once. Copper's head shot up, his ears snapped forward. And then he broke into a full gallop, an eager, powerful run that carried him across the field with a joy that felt almost wild. Instead of stopping when he reached Dean, Copper circled him in a wide arc, tossing his head, bucking lightly like a young horse showing off. Then he skidded to a stop in front of Dean and shoved his nose firmly into the man's chest, as if saying, "You're mine! I found you! Don't disappear again." Dean laughed, an honest, unguarded sound that Amy had never heard from him in person. Not broken, not guilty. Just pure, uncomplicated happiness. When the video ended, Amy found herself crying hard enough that she had to sit down. They weren't grief tears. They were something gentler, bigger, relief, pride, closure. Copper hadn't just gone home. He had come back to life. The updates continued through the summer. Copper's coat gleamed. His muscles filled out. His eyes, once shadowed by sadness, shone with a confidence that hadn't been there before. He and Dean rode the trails that wound through the property. They worked quietly in the barn together. They stood side by side in the pasture during sunsets, simply sharing the same space as if making up for years lost. Dean didn't take a single day for granted. He never missed a vet appointment or a farrier visit. His feed room was stocked better than most professional barns, and every night, before turning off the lights in the barn aisle, he paused at Copper's stall and rested a hand on the gelding's neck. "Good night, buddy," he whispered. "I love you. Sleep easy." Copper would flick his ears, exhale softly, and lean his weight into Dean's touch. Some bonds don't just survive hardship, they grow deeper because of it. Copper's homecoming didn't just change life for him and Dean, it rippled outward, touching the people who had played even the smallest part in his journey, reshaping the way they worked, the way they saw their roles, even the way they viewed the world. Beverly felt it first. She'd witnessed countless rescues, horses snatched from slaughter pens, animals surrendered in heartbreaking condition, animals whose pasts were mysteries filled in only by scars. She had seen reunions too, but never one like this. Never one that stitched together years of separation with the same effortless certainty as Copper recognizing Dean. It stayed with her, enough that she began rethinking how Rolling Hills Rescue operated. She started taking detailed records, photos of horses on arrival, vet notes, behavioral descriptions, distinctive markings, any hint of history. Not for paperwork, for people. Someone out there might be searching, she told her volunteers. We owe them a chance to rediscover each other. So, she built a database, organized, searchable, thorough. A place where stories wouldn't vanish the moment a horse walked through her gates. But that wasn't all. Copper's story reminded her that not every surrender came from neglect. Sometimes it came from desperation, from people choosing the horse's survival over their own comfort. That kind of sacrifice deserved support, not judgment. And so, she launched a hardship program, small at first, funded mostly out of her own pocket and a few generous donors, feed vouchers, temporary boarding, assistance connecting owners to financial resources. A safety net meant to keep horses with the people who love them whenever possible. If we can prevent another Copper from ending up at an auction, she said, we've done something good. Even Wesley, the hardened auctioneer who'd spent decades trying not to let stories sink too deep, wasn't immune to the change. Copper's note haunted him, the trembling handwriting, the apology written with love and grief braided together. He began sharing the story at industry meetings, forcing people to look at the emotional reality behind these animals. These aren't products, he told the room full of seasoned auction men and women. They're lives, and sometimes they're someone's last hope. He pushed for partnerships with rescues, for humane protocols for abandoned horses, for staff training rooted in compassion rather than efficiency. Some resisted, many listened, because it's hard to deny the truth of a story that ends with a horse galloping across a field to reunite with the person who saved him, and whom he saved in return. But the greatest transformation, of course, belonged to Copper and Dean. They slipped into a life so natural it felt predestined. Dean built his routines around Copper, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Every morning he walked to the barn with a kind of reverence, as if honored just to see Copper waiting for him. And Copper, with his brightening eyes and soft knickers, greeted him like a friend who had finally returned from a long journey. Their life was simple: work, chores, trail rides, quiet evenings. But it was the kind of simplicity that feels earned, a peace forged through loss, rebuilt by persistence, sealed by reunion. And all across the small community of people who had touched Copper's story, something had shifted. More kindness, more awareness, more willingness to see the human behind the hardship. Copper had done that, just by surviving, just by loving one man enough to never forget him. Years passed gently on Dean's little farm. Copper aged the way good horses do, softly, gracefully, his coat slowly dusting over with gray, his steps a little slower, but never unsure. He spent his days in wide green pastures and his nights in a warm, safe stall, never hungry, never cold, never alone again. And through every season, Dean was there. Morning feedings, evening grooming, trail rides on cool days, quiet companionship on the hot ones. Dean never treated Copper like a possession. He treated him like a promise kept. The darkest period of his life never truly left him, but it changed shape. The memory of losing everything, the job, the house, the sense of stability lingered like an old scar. But so did the memory of the one constant who'd stood by him when everyone else disappeared. Copper wasn't just a horse he'd owned once. He was the anchor that pulled Dean through the worst storm he'd ever faced. Dean rebuilt his life with intention, savings tucked away, multiple income streams, backups for every backup, anything to ensure Copper would never again face the consequences of Dean's misfortune. He joined a support group for people who had experienced homelessness, speaking honestly about the shame, the fear, the resilience required to start over. He volunteered at the shelter that had given him a bed when he had nowhere else to go. Rock bottom teaches you who you are, he would say, but it also teaches you what you can become. Sometimes, late in the evenings when the sun melted into the fields and shadows stretched long across Copper's stall, Dean would sit on an overturned bucket and talk to him. Not because Copper could answer, but because the horse had always listened better than most people. He told Copper about the guilt he had carried, about the nights he'd searched online until dawn, about the countless strangers who'd told him to move on, about the stubborn hope that refused to die. Copper would stand quietly, head lowered toward Dean, his breath warm and steady. And every so often, the gelding would rest his chin gently on Dean's shoulder, the same simple gesture he'd done the day they reunited. Forgiveness, connection, an unspoken, "We're okay now." When Dean's young nephew came to visit one summer, the boy fell in love with Copper almost instantly. He spent hours brushing the old horse, feeding him treats, reading him stories out loud in a voice still too small for the words he chose. One evening, he looked up at Dean, puzzled. "Uncle Dean, why is Copper so special to you?" Dean hesitated, glancing at Copper's gray-flecked coat, the gentle eyes that had seen both the best and worst of him. "Because he taught me something," Dean said slowly. "He taught me that love isn't just about holding on when things get hard. Sometimes love is about letting go. And if you're lucky, sometimes love finds its way back to you when the time is right." The boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway, sensing there was something important in those words, something he'd understand someday. And maybe that's the real heart of Copper's story, that no matter how dark life gets, no matter how hopeless a situation feels, there are bonds strong enough to survive distance, time, and circumstance. There are acts of love that look like loss from the outside, but are sacrifice at their core. There are reunions waiting on the other side of the worst days of our lives. Copper lived out the rest of his years knowing he was wanted, cherished, home, and Dean lived knowing he kept his promise to become the man his horse deserved, a happy ending in its purest form, a reminder that hope isn't naive, that compassion matters, that sometimes the miracle isn't the reunion itself, but the persistence that gets us there. And really, what more could any of us hope for?